How you going, guys? Curtis from Cutting Edge Engineering. Today we are getting back onto the Franna crane project, and we have seen all of your comments asking what's happening with it and when we're going to get back onto it. And in case you missed it, we did an update post back in March about the Franna crane, and in that we explained that the priorities and the purpose of the Franna have changed. So we've had the overhead crane installed and have purchased a 5-tonne forklift, and Scott's Transport are only 5 minutes down the road, so if there's anything we need to lift, we can just give them a call and they can come down and move it for us. So naturally the urgency to have our own crane was no longer there, and there were a lot of other workshop projects that took priority. And the main one was completely reorganising the workshop and getting the mega bore installed and set up. And now we've got that installed and commissioned ready for work, we've got a little bit more time up our sleeve, so we're going to get back onto the Franna. So the purpose and the need for the crane have completely changed. It is now basically 100% a hobby build, and there are a few things that I wanted to do originally, but we quickly decided not to. They wouldn't have actually changed the function of the crane, and they would have added extra time to the project. But now that we have a little bit of extra time up our sleeve, we're going to do it, because it is going to completely change the overall look of the crane. And all of the modifications that we want to do are not going to stop this crane from being able to be certified. Before we share any more about those modifications, there is something that we need to complete, and that is the front bumper. We did leave that undecided, but I have sent it out and had a new pressing line put in it, and it has changed the overall look, so we're going to get on to finishing that off. So I've had a 45-degree bend pressed onto the bottom edge, and that just helps make everything look a little bit nicer and in proportion. But before I tack it on, I do want to cut a bit more of an angle on each end, just to make it look a little bit nicer. Now that's done, the next thing I need to do is fit some end plates, and I've got some scrap material. I'm just going to mark them out, cut them to size and tack them in place. I'll just fill that in fine. Now I've got that tacked together, I'm just going to mark center and then we can get it into position on the front end. You like it?
No. Do you like it?
It'll flip it over.
Well, and put it up the other way.
Yeah. So after fitting that in place, it doesn't look as good as we thought it was going to. There's just something not right about the overall look and the angles. So we're going to flip it over and put the top on the bottom and see if that looks any better. I like that better.
Yeah, I like that better too, I think.
So we're much happier with how that looks. All the angles just seem to work out a lot better. But before I go and weld it in position, I'm just going to tack it in place and get the forklift out of the way. And then we're going to have a look from different angles and make sure it's exactly how we want it. So we've had a good look at it and we're really happy with how it looks. So now we can weld it out. And to weld this, I'm using ER70S6 in a 0.9, and I'm backing that up with Argo Shield Universal. For the downhand weld on the top of the bumper, I'm running that at 23 volts and 6.5 meters of wire a minute. And now I'm going to increase the wire speed to 7 meters of wire a minute for the overhead weld. And to weld the end plate onto the bumper, because I have a little bit of a gap there and I want good penetration, I'm going to do a weave vertical up weld at 19 volts and 4.5 meters of wire a minute. So that's our bumper fully welded. I'm not going to grind that yet because we have a lot of grinding to do over the entire crane, and I'm going to save that for another time. But while I'm welding, I do have some 25 by 5mm flat bar I need to weld onto these faces to fill in this void. In our 3D design, that had a tighter radius. Unfortunately, when they pressed it, they used the wrong size tooling, which gave it a larger radius and resulted in a 5mm misalignment. But it's an easy enough solution for us to fill that in with some flat bar. So now with that done, there is one more thing that I want to do, and that is trim off these corners so everything lines up perfectly. And to do that, I'm going to be using my 9-inch grinder. So I could definitely cut this using the oxy torch, but it does make a lot more mess, which means a lot more cleanup. Righto guys, so that's the modifications completed on the front end for now. The next thing I want to do is show you another one of the modifications I want to do, and it has to do with the boom.
What have you got? Now you've lost it. You got it? Oh. Hey.
Righto guys, so as you can see with the boom in place and it being in its horizontal position, it's only about 20 mil off where it's actually going to be pinned onto the crane, but there is a massive gap between the bottom of the boom and the top of the cab. And that gap at the moment is around about 280 mil. So that gap is just far too much for me. Clearly it does work and that's how the crane always worked, but I do think it can be made look a hell of a lot better. So this is definitely not going to be a small modification. There is going to be quite a lot involved and a lot we're going to have to consider and calculate to make sure everything is going to work correctly. We are going to be modifying the mast and moving the pivot position down in order to close the gap between the bottom of the boom and the top of the cab. We also will need to modify the boom lift cylinders so they work correctly and we get the right angle, and we are going to have to relocate the winch because there isn't enough clearance behind the boom to mount the winch because it will interfere with the bonnet on the motor. So I know some of you might think I'm absolutely crazy for taking on a modification like this, but what this project has now become is basically a blank canvas where I'm free to do whatever I want to do and I don't have a deadline on it. I'm able to make these modifications that I've always wanted to, and I absolutely love this kind of thing. If I can take something and make it different, unique, or even better, I'm going to do it. But before we start modifying anything, I am going to get Troy out here and we're going to completely draw the boom and the mast and all of the pivot positions. We'll then input that information into SolidWorks. We will then make the modifications we want to, run simulations and make sure everything is going to work before we actually start modifying the actual crane. But that is not the only modification. Something else I've always wanted to do is shorten the boom because I think it's far too long for a 14-ton crane. So where I'm standing is about the length I would like the boom, and that means I would have to shorten it by about 1 meter. And shortening the boom is going to bring everything into proportion, especially when we remove that gap between the bottom of the boom and the cab. But we're not going to start any modifications on shortening the boom until we are 100% sure that all the mods we want to do to the mast are going to work out correctly. But that's not all. There is one more modification that I definitely want to do, and that is to lower the crane. Because at the moment, with the crane at its standard height, there is far too much gap between the top of the tyres and the wheel arches. And like everything else on the crane that we want to modify, it is extremely out of proportion, and I know we can improve that, and it's going to make it look so much better. Not only that, it is going to lower the crane, which is going to bring down the centre height, making it a lot more stable, and it's also going to allow access into hard to reach places. So lowering the crane at the moment is just an idea, and before we can move forward with that, we actually need to make sure it is achievable. So what I'm going to do is bring in the diff housing, mount it onto the crane in its standard location, put a wheel up against it, and then we can see what we're going to need to do. So that's the diff in its standard position. Now we're going to put a wheel in place. So as you can see with the wheel in place, there is a massive amount of clearance all the way around it. That is actually not necessary because the diff is mounted solid onto the frame. We don't need clearance around it for suspension travel or anything like that. And the diff doesn't pivot to steer the crane. The pivoting and steering happens from the center joint where it articulates. Not only does it look absolutely ridiculous, that amount of clearance is not necessary at all. So ideally, I would like to bring the bottom of the wheel arch to about 10 mil off the tire, which means we're going to have to lift the diff about 120 mil. Knowing that measurement, we're going to get the wheel and tyre out of the way and start having a look at what we need to do. So this is just a general idea on what we're going to need to do. What we've done is measure up 120 mil, which will be the height for the diff once we make the modification. So obviously there are more calculations and measurements that are going to be involved, but this is just a general idea. We're also going to have to notch out the chassis to allow clearance for the diff housing to slide into it. But something we also need to take into account is the angle of that plate. At the moment it is set on an angle, and that is to align the pinion coming out of the diff center up into the output shaft. But because we are going to be lifting the diff 120 mil, we won't need that angle anymore, so the plate will actually be horizontal, which will bring the pinion and the output shaft into alignment. So that's that part of the modifications, but something else we need to take into account is the clearance between the diff housing and the bottom plate of the chain box, because at the moment there's only about 40 mil. So what that means is we're going to have to cut a hole in the chain box to allow the diff housing to pass through it to give us the clearance. So all things considered, modifying the front to lift the diff is very achievable. There aren't any problems there. But what I'm interested to see is if we have any interference issues between the engine and the hydraulic pump with the rear diff. Righto guys, so that's the rear diff in its standard location, and as you can see there is enough room around the hydraulic pump and the sump for the diff to move without interfering with anything. But taking into account the suspension on the rear, to reduce the gap between the wheel and the wheel arches, we were going to have to lift the diff about 200 mil. But the problem with that, we only have about 60 mil of clearance between the top of the diff and the hydraulic pump. And not too far away from that is the engine. So what that means is we're definitely going to have to relocate the engine, but that is not going to be a big problem because I still haven't welded in the engine mounts. But relocating the engine means we would have to modify the front and rear drive shafts in order to make them fit. But instead of that, something I am definitely considering and something I always wanted to do when we upgraded the engine was to upgrade the transmission to an Allison. But we did run into a roadblock when I went to try and buy a transmission from the Allison dealer here in Australia. But I'm definitely going to pursue that again and see if we can get our hands on one. It is going to be the best solution for our problem. We're going to be able to eliminate that weak gearbox. It's also going to allow us more flexibility in mounting the engine and the transmission wherever we want. And doing that is going to make our diff modification achievable. And we're also going to get on to measuring up the mast and everything to do with the boom so we can put that into SolidWorks and run those simulations to make sure everything's going to work. So all of the modifications, if we can successfully do them, is going to make this crane 1,000 times better than the day it rolled out of the factory. So that's where we're at with the Franna. Let us know your thoughts on all the mods that we want to do. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.
I'm right there with you.
Oh, fuck. How do we start that? Oh, my finger.
Do you want to clamp it?
What?
Oh, no reason.
Because it gets fucking hot. Before we get on to all of the other modifications that are going to make this crane look super cool. No, I don't like it. Before we get on to all of the other... Wait. Before we start... Oh, wait. Righto. But wait, how do we start?